The storm had teeth, and it had been gnawing him down to nothing for the better part of a night and a day. The man could no longer feel his hands. He knew they still gripped the strap of his emptied satchel only because he could see them, pale as tallow, curled and useless. Snow drove sideways across the moor, and ropes and sheets, erasing the road, erasing the sky, erasing the difference between falling down and lying still. Twice, already he had gone to his knees. Twice something stubborn and wordless had hauled him upright again. He did not think it would manage a third time. Then, through the white, a light. It swam low and gold and impossibly far, and he fixed on it the way a drowning man fixes on the surface. 1 foot, then the other. He fell against a fence rail he hadn't seen, tore his palm, felt nothing. A shape resolved out of the murk. A long, low building hunched into the hillside. Smoke ragged from its chimney. A door meant walls. Walls meant living through the night. He struck the wood with the flat of a hand he couldn't feel. Once. Again. A third time. Harder. Until the whole frame shuddered. Bolts. The scrape of them. The door cracked, and warmth spilled out into the dark like something poured, and with it the smell of peat smoke and bread, and the amber blur of a room he would have wept to enter. A woman stood in the gap, a shawl clutched at her throat, her face half in shadow and half in firelight. "Please," he said, or tried to. His voice came out a ruin. "Shelter. 1 night. I can pay." But he couldn't. His purse was 2 nights gone, taken on the road with his horse. "I'll work. Anything. Please." Her eyes moved over him. The frozen rags, the split lip, the ice in his beard. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And the door closed. The bolt slid home. The gold light narrowed to a seam, then to nothing. Under his sodden collar a heavy ring hung on a cord, a thing he had told no living soul he carried. His numb fingers closed around it out of habit, the way another man clutches a saint's medal. Then his knees found the snow, and this time nothing hauled him up. Rena Marrow stood with her back against the barred door and her heart going like a hare's. She could still see him. She would see him for a long while, she suspected. The ruin of a face, the eyes that had been too clear, too aware, for a man that far gone. She pressed the heels of her hands against her own eyes until sparks bloomed there, as if she could scrub the image out. It didn't work. It never did. Coward, she told herself very softly, so the word wouldn't carry up the stairs. Up there, past the low ceiling with its blackened beams, Tamsin was asleep, 9 years old and small for it, curled in the truckle bed under every blanket the inn still owned, her breath whistling faint through a chest that had never been strong since the fevered 2 winters past, Corin's little sister. All that was left of Corin at all. Now his laugh gone under the black water of the bleak Fen Weir, his name struck off the tenant rolls before his body had even been found, and the child handed to Rena like a debt she was somehow expected to be grateful for. She would not risk Tamsin. She had promised the memory of her husband that much on the night they dragged him out gray and swollen, and the steward's men had stood on the bank with their lanterns and their patient, watching faces. That was the thing the stranger at the door could not know. There were rules on the Cindermore now, and the newest of them had come down from Velmore Hall not a fortnight ago, nailed to the church door and the market cross in the steward's crabbed hand. No traveler, beggar, or unknown person to be housed, fed, or hidden within the bounds of the estate, save by the written leave of the steward, Aldous Varn. Offenders to forfeit their lease, and Rena's lease on the Thornwake Inn was already a fiction, a thread the steward let her dangle from precisely because a dangling thing is so easy to cut. She knew why the rule existed too, though no one said it aloud. Strangers asked questions. Strangers carried word off the moor to places the steward's reach didn't stretch. A man who sheltered no strangers heard no dangerous questions, and a village that heard no questions never learned to ask its own. Varn's men watched the road. They watched her especially. Twice this month she'd found boot prints in the snow beneath the taproom window, and once, Garrick Varn himself, the steward's son, with his father's ledgers and his mother's smile, had ridden into her yard for no reason he'd trouble to name, and sat his horse there, looking at her door until the light failed. If she opened that door tonight, and the wrong eyes saw, she would lose the inn. And if she lost the inn, she lost the roof over a sick child who had no one else in the world. So she had said sorry, and she had closed the door. And it had been, she told herself, the only sane thing a friendless woman could do. The wind screamed under the eaves. A loose shutter banged, once, like a question. Ran across to the fire and knelt and did not warm herself. She thought of the man's hands. She had seen a great many hands in her years of setting down cups and taking up coins, the cracked red hands of drovers, the ink-stained hands of the steward's clerks, her own roughening year on year. Ah, the stranger's hands, blue as they'd been, had not been a laborer's hands. There had been a signet's pale band worn into one finger where a ring used to sit, a gentleman's hands then brought to beggary. The Moor did not care what a man had been. The Moor would take a gentleman as gladly as a pauper, and by morning the drifts would make them the same shape. By morning, she looked at the door. She looked at the stairs. She thought of Corin, and of the lanterns on the bank, and of every time in her life she had swallowed a wrong because it was safer than choking on it. You, she whispered to herself, are going to be a fool one more time. Then she was moving. The heavy cloak off its peg, her boots, and the storm lantern she filled with shaking hands, and a spill from the fire. She took the poker too, for what good it might do. At the door, she stopped, breathed, lifted the bar as quietly as a bar can be lifted, and stepped out into a night that hit her like a slammed gate. The tracks were already going. Where the man had stood there was only a hollow filling in with white, and beyond it, faint, a dragging line that led away toward the fence and the black moor past it, growing shallower with every second the snow kept falling. Rena lifted the lantern and followed them before they could vanish entirely. She found him at the second fence, past the gate, where the ground dropped toward the fen and the wind came off the ice with nothing to break it. He was down, not curled against the cold the way the living do, but sprawled and open, one arm flung out, snow already gathering in the folds of him, softening his edges, making him part of the ground. For one dreadful moment, Rena was on the weir bank again, with the lantern light on black water. Then the lantern in her own hand shook, and the shadows moved, and she saw his chest rise, barely, a hand's breadth, once. "No, you don't," she said. Her voice cracked the silence like a dropped plate. "No, not on my land. I've buried enough." Getting him up was a thing she would never afterward be able to describe. He was a tall man and a dead weight, and she was one cold woman with a bad shoulder and a lantern she dared not drop. She hooked her arms beneath his and hauled and swore, and slipped and hauled again, and the Moor fought her for every yard, and twice she simply sat down in the snow with his head against her shoulder and gasped like a landed fish before she found more to give. She could not take him to the house. That much she'd settled before she left it. The taproom window, the watchers, the child asleep above. But the stable stood nearer than the inn. In any case, its low door on the lee side, out of the road's sight. She got him through it at last and kicked it shut behind them. And the sudden stillness, no wind, only the shift and breath of the old cob in his stall, felt like mercy. There was a tack room at the stable's end, with a small hearth she used on falling nights. She built the fire with kindling from the box and coaxed it and fed it until the little room began grudgingly to hold heat. She stripped the frozen coat off him, and the sodden shirt beneath, and wrapped him in the horse blankets and her own cloak, and chafed his ruined hands between hers, and talked the whole time. Nonsense, scolding. The sort of thing she'd murmured to Tamsin in the fever nights, because talking was the only thing left that she could do while the fire did the rest. Slowly, the gray went out of him. Slowly, the shivering came back, which she knew from the drover's talk was a thing to be glad of, a body remembering how to fight. And as the warmth reached him, he began to speak, in the tangled way of a man swimming up from somewhere deep. Most of it was fever babble, but not all. "Won't sign it," he muttered quite clearly, his brow nodding. "Tell Redfern the accounts are false, all of them. False." And then a name she didn't know, a woman's, said with such grief that Rena's throat tightened to hear it. Then, sharper, a command snapped out to some remembered servant, in a voice that did not ask whether it would be obeyed, a voice from a world of marble floors and standing men, a voice that had no business coming out of the wreck by her fire. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. Beneath the grime and the blood, he was perhaps 33. There was an old scar through one dark eyebrow, and another worse, along the ribs. The clean, straight seam a blade leaves, not an accident. His hands, warming now to a living color, were hard across the knuckles, but smooth in the palm. Hands that had held a sword far more than a spade. And when she drew the blanket up to his chin, her fingers brushed a cord at his neck, and the cord had a weight on it, and the weight slid free of his collar and swung into the firelight. A ring. A man's heavy gold signet, far too fine to belong to any traveler who'd beg a stranger for bread. She turned it toward the flame without lifting the cord from his neck, and the light caught the device cut deep into its face, a stag beneath a crown of thorns, and letters worn but readable around the rim. Rena had seen that stag before. It was cut into the great gates of Velmore Hall. It was stamped in wax on every writ the steward nailed to the church door. It was the mark of the house that owned the ground she knelt on, the debt she carried, the weir that had taken her husband, the mark of the Duke of Velmore, who had not set foot in this country in 7 years, and whom scarcely a soul on the cinder moor had ever seen. Her hand had gone quite still. "Who are you?" she breathed. The man's eyes did not open, but his hand came up fast and sudden, and terribly strong for all his weakness, and closed around her wrist. And in the same moment, from across the yard, muffled by stone and storm but unmistakable, came the thud of hooves turning in at her gate, more than one horse, and the pounding of a gloved fist on the inn's barred door, and a voice she knew far too well, raised against the wind. "Open up, Widow Marrow, steward's business open, in the name of Aldous Varn." The grip on her wrist was iron, but the eyes that opened above it were not a madman's. They found her face, sharpened, and understood in half a heartbeat everything the pounding across the yard meant. "Don't," the stranger breathed. "Don't tell them I'm here." "Ah, let go of me," Rena whispered back, "or I'll tell them nothing and let them find you anyway." He let go at once. That more than anything decided her. A desperate man does not obey so quickly. She snatched the poker, banked the little fire to a sullen glow so no light showed under the door, and hissed at him to be silent as the grave. Then she went out into the storm to lie for her life. Garrick Varn sat his horse in the middle of her yard, 2 of his father's men steaming in the cold behind him, and the look he gave her when she came out was the look a cat gives a hole it knows a mouse went down. "Widow Marrow, you keep late hours. You keep later ones, Master Garrick, to be abroad on a night like this." She pulled the door shut at her back. What's the steward want at this hour that couldn't wait for daylight? A man. Garrick swung down, boots crunching, and walked past her to the tap-room window as if he owned the glass. Traveler on the South Road at dusk, ragged sort, on foot, no leave to be on the estate at all. The watch lost him in the weather somewhere near your fen. He turned. "Your fen, widow. Your door being the only door for 3 miles. So," he smiled his mother's smile. "Have you been charitable tonight?" Do I look as though I can afford charity?" She let him hear the bitterness. It was the truest thing she'd said. "Look at the place. I've a sick child, a cold hearth, and a lease I'm told each quarter I'm lucky to hold. If a beggar knocked, I sent him on, same as your father's notice tells me to. She lifted her chin toward the church road. You nailed it up yourselves. He studied her a long moment. Then he shouldered past her and went through the tap room with a lantern, kicking the settle, opening the ale cupboard, climbing halfway up the stair until Tamsin's thin, frightened voice floated down, asking who was there. Whatever he saw in Rena's face when the child spoke satisfied him more than any search. He came back down and did not go near the stable. Men who terrorize the weak learn to read fear, and hers was entirely real. It simply wasn't fear of the thing he hunted. If you're lying to me, Garrick said pleasantly at the door, you'll go into the fen after your husband. He let that sit. Good night, widow. She did not breathe until the hoofbeats had thinned into the storm. When she came back to the tack room, the stranger was sitting up against the wall, wrapped in her cloak, and he had heard all of it. She could see that he had. The lucidity in him now was total, as though the fever had burned away everything but the mind beneath. Into the fen, after your husband, he repeated softly. They killed a man. They killed my husband. Rena stayed by the door, the poker still in her hand, and found she was shaking. Corin found something in the accounts he kept for the mill, debts owed to the estate that no one had ever borrowed. Rents paid twice, once by the tenant, once again on paper, so the difference could go into a pocket that wasn't the Duke's. He was going to take it to the assize court at Halloway. Her voice did not break. Quite. 3 days later, they pulled him out of the Bleakfen Weir and swore he'd been drunk. He never drank. Now, she lifted the poker a little. You will tell me who you are, and you will tell me the truth, because I have hidden you from the man who drowned my husband, and I would like to know whether I've been a fool twice in one night. The stranger looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then he reached up, lifted the cord over his own head, and held a signet out to her on his open palm, surrendering it the way he'd surrendered her wrist. My name is Amrys Cardew, he said, and the stag on that ring is mine. I am the Duke of Velmore. This is my land, Widow Marrow. And every wrong you have just named to me was done in my name while I was 3 countries away, and could not be troubled to read what I signed. The poker lowered, not from mercy, from the sheer weight of it. For 7 years the Duke of Velmore had been a rumor, a stag in wax, a name on the writ that struck Corin from the rolls. And here he sat on her tack room floor, half dead, the man she had refused, and then dragged from the snow, the source of the whole cold river of grief that had drowned her life. You, she said, you did this. Varn did this, but he could not have without me. 4 months ago, a letter reached me at my post in the east, no name to it, saying the people of Velmore were being eaten alive, and their lord had let it happen. I told myself it was spite. Then I could not sleep, so I came home the quiet way to see before Varn could dress the stage for me. And 2 nights ago 4 men took my horse, my purse and my name on the Halloway road, and left me walking. His mouth twisted. I spent 7 years believing I had suffered enough that no one could ask more of me. Your husband died proving me wrong. That is a very fine speech, Rena said, for a man who let it happen. It is not a speech, it is a debt. He closed his hand around the ring. I cannot give you Corin back, but I can give you the thing he died to get to the assize. I can prove Varn a thief and a murderer, and do it as the only man in this country his court cannot silence. I need what you know. And you, his eyes went briefly toward the low ceiling, toward the child above them, need what only I can give, a roof Varn cannot pull down, and a name over your door. His men will not dare come through. You're offering me protection, she laughed, and it hurt. The last man who protected this land is sitting in my stable. Then let me be worth the ride. He held out his hand, palm up, and the ring gone back onto its cord at his throat. Justice, Widow Marrow, not only for the Moor, for Corin, by his right name, in open court, whatever it costs me. And if standing beside me ever puts you or that child in more danger than staying away, you have my word you walk free of it, and I'll not hold you. Those are my terms. Have you better ones?" The fire ticked. Above, the storm had begun, at last, to ease. Renamero looked at the offered hand of the man she had turned away, and thought that she had spent her whole life being careful, and that careful had buried her husband just the same. She put her cold hand in his. "For Corin," she said. "By his name, by his name," said the Duke of Velmore. They left before the moor was fully light, while the drift still held their tracks close, and the steward's men would be sleeping off the storm. Getting there was its own quiet ordeal. Emrys could not sit a horse far, so they went the drover's way that Rena knew and Varn's men did not. Down through the willow car, along the old sheep drove, with Tamsin bundled on the cob, and the Duke walking a hand on its withers, and Rena leading, lantern-hooded, her heart in her mouth at every dark hedge. She had shuttered the thornwake and left it looking abandoned. If this went wrong, she would have no inn to go back to. She had made her peace with that somewhere in the night, and was surprised to find how little it mattered against the child's warm weight on the saddle. Velmore Hall rose out of the last of the mist like something a giant had set down and forgotten. Rena had seen its gates all her life, and never once been past them. Now she stood in the great cold court, and understood that the house was not truly lived in at all. Half the windows shuttered from within, ivy in the guttering, a fountain choked with last autumn's leaves. Varn did not keep his seat here. She would learn. He ruled from the fat new steward's house by the mill and let the hall stand shut, a monument to an absent master, staffed by the handful of old servants too loyal or too poor to turn away. It was one of those who opened the small door by the kitchens, a spare, straight woman of 60-odd, with flour on her sleeves and a cleaver in her fist, plainly prepared to use it. Then she saw the man leaning in the doorway, saw past the beard and the ruin to the bones of a face, and the cleaver clattered to the flags. "Master Emrys," Mrs. Quillen's voice came out of her in pieces. Oh, they said, "the last letter said you'd not come, that you never answered." And then the housekeeper who had, Rena guessed, held this dying house together on nothing but stubbornness and memory, put her apron to her face, and wept as though something long clenched had finally been allowed to let go. That was the moment Rena stopped doubting him. A man may fake a great many things. He cannot fake being wept over by the woman who raised him. Rena had never in her life stood in a room so large it had its own weather. The hall beyond the kitchen passage ran up into a dark, she couldn't see the top of, hung with the antlered heads of stags 100 years dead, and her boots on the flags sounded like an intrusion. Tamsin pressed against her skirts and stared at everything with round, feverish eyes, and Rena understood, with a small, hot flush of something between shame and defiance, that she and the child were the shabbiest things in it. She had spent her whole life on the wrong side of these gates, being told, in 100 small ways, that this world was not for her. Now, she stood inside it because its master owed her a debt of blood, and she made herself stand straight the way she had once made herself stand straight on a weir bank, while men with lanterns watched her grief and called it an accident. They took him in and fed him, and there was much that Rena, standing awkward with Tamsin's hand in hers among people to whom she was plainly a mystery, only half followed. But the shape of it emerged over that first long day. The hall's old people had watched Varn's rise for 7 years and been powerless against it, because their word was nothing, and the Duke's letters, when they came at all, only ever thanked the good steward for his diligence. They had written the truth 12 times. Not one letter, they now understood, had ever left the estate unread by Varn's hand. "He keeps 2 sets of books, Mrs. Prawn," Quillen said low, when the child was abed and the 3 of them sat in the one warm room. "Everyone below stairs knows it, and no one can prove it. One for your grace all sweet and balanced, and the true one that his own clerk keeps under lock for him." She looked at Rena. Your Corin was the only man ever to lay eyes on a page of the second and live even 3 days. Where does Varn keep it? Emrys asked. Locked, at the steward's house. But there's the old estate room here that he uses when he plays at being master for visitors. He signs things there, leaves things. The housekeeper hesitated. I've never dared. Rena was already rising. I've buried the daring half of my family. I'll dare. The estate room was cold and grand and smelled of the steward who used it, beeswax and cold ash and, faintly, the Swedish pomade Garrick wore. Every drawer they tried was locked. Twice, Mrs. Quillen startled at a sound from the shuttered court, and they froze. 3 thieves in their own house. The candle pinched dark between the housekeeper's fingers until the silence held again. It was there at last, while Emrys worked the lock of the great desk with a patience that spoke of a misspent boyhood, and the housekeeper's hand shook around the relit flame, that Rena found the thing that stopped her breath. Not a ledger. A single loose sheet used to blot another slipped behind the drawer. A page of Varn's own crabbed accounting, a column of names with sums beside them, and, against several, a small, neat cross. She did not need to be told what the crosses meant. She had seen enough of them nailed to the church door, beside the words forfeit and deceased. Halfway down the column, in the steward's hand, was her husband's name, C. Merrow. A sum. And beside it, dated 3 days before they pulled him from the weir, the small, neat cross, and 2 words she would carry to her own grave. Matter closed. She did not weep. That surprised her. She had thought, if she ever found proof, she would come apart. But grief long carried turns to something else, something with an edge, and what Rena felt looking at that little cross was closer to the cold, clean anger of a woman, finally handed a reason. Emrys took the page from her fingers as carefully as if it were made of ash and would not survive rough handling. This hangs him, he said quietly. This, and the true book it came from, and one living voice to swear to how it was kept. He folded it into his breast. We have the first. We will get the rest. The days that followed had a strange close texture Rena would remember all her life. The shut hall, the winter light. The 2 of them bent over what scraps of proof the loyal servants could smuggle from the steward's house, one careful page at a time. She learned the shape of the fraud until she could have drawn it, the doubled rents, the phantom debts, the leases forfeited, the moment a family grew too poor to fight or too curious to be safe. And Emrys learned the more from her, its names, its dead, and its small brave people, until the abstraction he had signed away for 7 years had faces, and each face seemed to cost him something to look at. He worked like a man paying down a debt he knew he could never clear, and he was, to Rena's quiet astonishment, gentle with the child. Tamsin's cough was bad those first nights, and it was Emrys as often as Rena who sat with her, teaching her a game of stones he'd learned from soldiers, telling her the names of the dead stags on the walls until she laughed, and named one after the cob. Rena would stand in the doorway watching a Duke of the Realm cross-legged on the floor of a shut-up hall, patiently losing its stones to a 9-year-old, and feel something in her chest she had thought the weir had taken for good. It frightened her more than Varn did. One night when the candle was low and Tamsin's cough had finally quieted overhead, Rena asked him the thing she had wondered since the fever babble in the tack room. Who was Aveline? His hands went still on the papers. My wife, he said at last. She died here, 7 winters gone, of a fever no different from the one that thins that child's breath above us. I was at court, being useful, being important. By the time the writer reached me, she was 3 days in the ground. He looked at the cold hearth, not at Rena. I could not stay in this house with her gone from it, so I left it. I left all of it, the land, the people, the books, to the one man who told me, kindly, that I need not trouble myself. I called it grief. It was cowardice. I turned away from everything that was mine because looking at it hurt, and a whole country paid for my comfort. His jaw tightened. You turned a freezing man from your door for one night to save a child, and you have not stopped flogging yourself for it. I turned away for 7 years, so do not, Widow Marrow, ever again call yourself the coward in this room." The fire settled. Something between them settled with it. Not romance, not yet, but the particular closeness of two people who have each named their worst wound aloud and found the other did not flinch. "Then we're a fine pair to go to war," Rena said. "The woman who turned one man away, and the man who turned away a whole more." "The best kind," he said, and almost smiled. It was Mrs. Quillen who broke it, coming quick and gray-faced through the door with a letter clutched in her hand, one intercepted from the steward's own rider, still warm from the man they'd bribed to lift it. "It's from Varn," she said. "To the county gentry, all of them." She set it down between them with a shaking hand. "He's calling them here. A great assembly, a fortnight hence, at the hall, to witness the reading of the new leases and to see the last free farms of the Cinder Moor passed to him by law." Her eyes went to Emrys. "He means to hold it under your own roof, your grace. In your name, with every family that could stand against him made to watch it done." Rena looked at the Duke, and the Duke looked at the folded letter, and the last of the fever warmth was gone from his face entirely. "Then he has just told us where," Emrys said softly. "And when. A fortnight was not long to build a war, and Emrys spent the first days of it teaching Rena the only weapon she lacked. You already have the truth," he told her the morning they began. "What you do not yet have is the way these people expect the truth to be delivered. They will not hear it from a woman who looks as though she has come to beg. They will hear it from one who looks as though she has come to grant." He had shed the beard by then, and the ruin of the road, and in a good coat brushed down by Mrs. Waugh. Quillen he was suddenly, disconcertingly, a different man, one who belonged under the antlered heads and the high dark ceilings. "We cannot yet let them see who I am. Varn's whole scheme depends on believing the Duke will never come. If he learns otherwise before the assembly, he will bolt for the coast with the true book under his arm, and we will chase him the rest of our lives. So until that day, I am Mr. Bully Ashby, a dull man of business sent ahead by the Duke's lawyer to look into the accounts, and you are the one person in this county with the standing to make a great lady listen, a widow whose husband was murdered for the very thing we mean to prove." "That isn't standing," Rena said. "That's a wound." "In the right room," said Emrys. "They are the same thing." He'd taught her the small grammar of that world, how to sit, how to let a silence do her arguing, how to answer a slight without stooping to notice it. She was quicker at it than either expected. A woman who has kept a taproom of drovers from each other's throats already knows more of managing people than most gentry learn in a lifetime. What she had to unlearn was the flinch, the habit of a body that had spent a year braced for the next blow. "Stop apologizing with your shoulders," he said once, and she straightened and did not slump again. There were harder lessons than posture. He made her sit through invented conversations, a bored viscount, a suspicious magistrate, a woman fishing sweetly for scandal, until she could feel the hook inside a pleasantry before she swallowed it. Once he baited her until she snapped back in the flat, furious voice of the taproom, and instead of correcting her, he laughed, the first true laugh she had heard from him, and said that was the one she must never use in company, and also the one he liked best. Their first test was a house Varn could not touch. 3 miles east past the boundary stone lived the Dowager Mistress Audeline Fenwick, 70 years old, twice widowed, rich in her own right, and beholden to no steward living. Her nephew had held a farm on the Cinder Moor until Varn's paper debts had swallowed it whole, and the boy had died soured and broken. The winter after Mrs. Fenwick had not forgotten. If any gentry voice on the moor would rise at the assembly, it was hers, and if Rena could not win one sympathetic old woman across a tea table, she would never win a hall full of the indifferent. They were shown into a drawing room stuffed with 40 years of other people's portraits, Mrs. Fenwick took one look at Emrys's careful clerk's manner, dismissed him as furniture, and fixed her small, bright eyes on Rena. "You're the innkeeper's widow, the one they say worked herself into a temper over an accident, a sip of tea. Convince me it wasn't one, girl. And be quick. I've buried better talkers than you'll ever be." So Rena did not talk well. She talked plainly. She told the old woman about the doubled rents and the phantom debts in the flat voice of someone reciting a thing she had lived rather than learned, and she laid on the tea table the copied figures in Emrys's neat hand. And last of all she said, "Your nephew's name is in the steward's own book, ma'am, with a little cross beside it, same as my husband's. I've seen the page. Varn calls it matter closed. I call it the two of them murdered by a pen." The room was very quiet. Mrs. Fenwick set down her cup with a hand that was not quite steady. "And the dull man of business," she said without looking at Emrys, "who copies figures in a hand far too fine for a clerk and sits in my drawing room like he owns the deed to it. What does he want?" "An honest witness at the assembly," said Emrys. "When the Duke's affairs are finally set right." "The Duke," Mrs. Fenwick laughed. A dry rattle. "The Duke has not troubled himself with this country in 7 years. You'll forgive an old woman if she does not hold her breath for his conscience." But her eyes had gone shrewd, moving between the two of them, and Rena felt the woman come to some private conclusion she chose not to speak aloud. "Nevertheless, I shall come to your assembly, girl. I have wanted to say a thing or two to Aldous Varn and company for a long while, and I find I have outlived the age of being afraid of him." She smiled, thin and fierce. "Bring your little crosses." They walked out into a thin, bright cold with the first crack, made one voice but a loud one, and Rena's heart was still going fast with the strange triumph of it when a rider came up the lane at a walk and stopped square in their path. Garrick Varn looked down at her from the saddle for a long moment, then his gaze slid to the well-dressed stranger at her side, and something worked behind his handsome face. "Widow, Marrow," he said slowly. "In good wool, keeping fine company, calling on the gentry. And here we all thought you'd crept off to die." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes at all. "My father will be so interested. And how is the little girl, Tamsin, isn't it? A child ought not be left with only servants for company. One does worry about who's minding her while her guardian plays at ladies." They had meant to move quietly for a few days yet. Garrick's words in the lane ended that. "He named the child," Rena said, the moment they were out of earshot, and Emrys heard the fear under the fury and did not insult her by soothing it. "He named her Chest, her name, that she's alone. That wasn't idle. That was a promise. Then we take her out of his reach today, and we move faster than his father can think." Emrys's jaw had set into the hard line she now knew meant the Duke was doing sums no one else could see. "There is a thing I have been putting off because it is dangerous. We can put it off no longer. Varn keeps the true book locked at the steward's house, but a locked book is only worth what the man who keeps it will swear to. There is a clerk, Pettifer. He has written every false figure with his own hand for 7 years, and Mrs. Quillen says he has not slept a whole night in 2 of them. A frightened man is a door, Rena. We are going to knock on it." Getting into the lion's den was in the end insultingly easy, because the lion had never imagined anyone would walk in the front. Rent day fell 2 days on. The steward's house stood open to a shuffling line of tenants come to pay, or to beg, or to sign away what they could no longer pay for. Mr. Ashby, agent of the Duke's lawyer, walked in among them with a leather folio under his arm, and the bored authority of a man sent to tick columns, and no one stopped him because men with folios and bored faces are the one kind of stranger a corrupt house never fears. Rena came a pace behind as his amanuensis, veiled, her heart slamming. The line moved with a terrible patience Rena knew in her own bones. She had stood in it herself a year ago, twisting her wedding ring, while a man in good black explained kindly why the roof over her head now belonged to someone else. She recognized faces along the wall, old Nan Petheridge, who had once given Corin apples, the Sowerby brothers, who had carried his coffin, all of them keeping their eyes on the floor, making themselves small. It took everything she had not to lift her veil and tell them to stand up straight. Not yet, she told herself, walking past their bowed heads. Not yet, but soon. The house was everything the hall was not. New, warm, and thick, with the smell of money recently spent. And there, at a high desk in the front room, gray and stooped over a ledger, sat a small man with ink to the second knuckle and the hunted eyes of a rabbit that has heard the dogs. Rena had expected a villain's creature and found instead a wreck of a man, a careful, timid clerk who had, she would guess, told himself for 7 years that he only kept the figures, that the figures were not the same as the deeds, that a man is not a murderer for writing down a number. The lie had eaten him alive. His collar was frayed, though the house around him dripped with new money. His hands trembled over the nib, and when he looked up and saw a stranger in a good coat asking for the accounts, the guilt in his face was so nakedly total that Rena marveled the whole county had not read it long ago. "His Grace's lawyer requires a sight of the current accounts," Emery said, pleasant and immovable, laying his folio on the desk. "Before the assembly. You'll have been told to expect the review." No one told me." Pettifer's eyes darted to the inner door and back. "Master Varn keeps the current book himself, sir. I only keep the rent roll." "Yes, that will do to begin." Emrys leaned in and dropped his voice below the shuffle of the queue, and every trace of the dull clerk went out of it. "Mr. Pettifer, look at me. You are going to be asked, very soon, in front of the whole county, whose hand wrote the false figures. It will be your hand they hold up. Varn will let it be your hand. He will weep and call you a thief, and let them take you for it, because that is what men like him keep men like you for. Unless the man who could hang you decides, instead, to be the reason you are believed. I can make you a witness. I cannot make you one after they have made you the culprit. Do you understand the difference? You have, until the assembly, to choose which you would rather be. It was too much, too fast. She saw that at once. Pettifer's face crumpled toward panic, his mouth opening on a cry that would bring the house down on them, and it was Rena who saved it, stepping past Emrys, lifting her veil so the little man could see her face. "My husband was Corin Marrow," she said softly. "You wrote his name in that book. I don't want you hanged, Mr. Pettifer. I want the man who told you to write it. That's all. Just the truth," said out loud, once she held his terrified eyes. "You'll sleep after. I promise you'll sleep." Something in the clerk broke and steadied at the same time. He gave the smallest nod, barely a nod at all, and then louder, in his reedy official voice, The rent roll, sir. Of course, if you'll step this way," which was when the inner door opened and Aldous Varn came out. Rena had built the steward into a monster across a year of grief, and the reality was worse for being so ordinary. A broad, comfortable man in good black, with a kind face and mild eyes, the sort of man you would trust to hold your money, which was, of course, precisely the point. Behind him came a woman all in dove-gray silk, slender and still, and where Aldous filled the doorway with false warmth, Corvina Varn cooled the whole room simply by entering it. Her eyes went over the agent once, sharp as a needle, and settled, with the faintest crease of a frown on his face, as though it reminded her of something she could not place. "Ashby, is it?" Aldous said warmly, reading the folio's stamped name. "Redfern's man. We had your master's letter. You're very welcome, sir. Very welcome, though you'll find nothing here but a country steward's dull good order." He beamed. "Corvina, my dear, some wine for the Duke's man." Aldous poured it himself, pressing it on them, walking the agent along a wall of tenancy maps and talking the whole time, a mild, plausible river of words about drainage and improvements and the sad necessity of firmness with folk who would not help themselves. It was, Rena realized, a performance he had given 100 times, and it had worked 100 times, because it was so much more comfortable to believe than the truth. But it was Corvina who did the real work. She drew Rena a little apart, ostensibly to admire the poor quality of her veil, and said in a voice pitched for two, "I know your face as well, girl, now I look at it properly. The Marrow woman. The one who made such a scene at the weir. A small, cold smile. How you've risen. A dead husband, a fine new coat, and a lawyer's man to carry your grudges for you. Do be careful, my dear. Women who climb on the backs of powerful men have such a very long way to fall, and they seldom fall alone." She stepped back, serene, and lifted her voice to a hostess's brightness. "More wine, Mr. Ashby? No, a pity. Do give our warmest regards to dear Mr. Redfern." They were almost to the door when Garrick came down the stair, pulling on his gloves, and for one heart-stopping moment, his eyes passed over the veiled woman and the dull agent without interest, and then snagged and came back. Rena felt Emrys go very still beside her, but Garrick's mind was full of his own errands, and a veiled clerk in a rent-day crowd was beneath the notice of a man on his way to enjoy himself. He looked away, shouldered past them into the yard, and was gone in a spatter of hoofbeats. It was the narrowest thing yet, and it bought them nothing but the knowledge of how thin the ice had become. They got out. They got Pettifer's flicker of a nod, and Mrs. Fenwick's promise, and the shape of a plan, and they got out. But Rena did not breathe freely until the steward's house was a mile behind them, and even then the memory of Corvina Vaughan's eyes on Emrys's face followed her like cold air under a door. "She knew you," Rena said. "She almost knew me. That is worse. A woman who almost remembers will not rest until she does." Emrys looked back down the empty road. "The assembly is tomorrow. And we have just told the cleverest of them that Redfern's dull agent has a face worth remembering, a widow at his side he cannot account for, and an interest in the one clerk who could sink the whole family." He was quiet a moment. "Vaughan will not wait for the assembly to move against us now. He'll move first. And he knows exactly where we are softest." Rena was already running for the hall, for the east wing, for the small warm room where she had left a 9-year-old with a cough and a game of stones. She knew before she reached the door. She knew it from the cold that breathed down the east wing corridor, from the way Mrs. Quillen's voice was calling Tamsin's name, somewhere above in a register Rena had never heard the composed old woman use. She took the last stairs 2 at a time with her skirts bunched in her fists. The room was empty. The window stood open to the cold, and on the little table, weighted under a single black stone from Tamsin's game, was a square of paper in the steward's own crabbed, unmistakable hand. The note said 7 words. Rena read them once, and the floor seemed to tilt under her. "The child is safe." For the moment below, no signature, only a small, neat cross, the same mark that stood beside Corin's name and Mrs. A. Fenwick's nephew's drawn now beside a blank space which was somehow the most terrible thing of all, a threat that left the worst to her imagination. She did not scream. She had learned, in a hard year, that screaming spent strength she would need. She stood very still, with the paper in her hand, and felt something in her go past fear, into a place colder and clearer, and when she turned to Emrys her voice came out flat and even. "You said if the child was ever in more danger for standing with you I could walk free of it. I'm calling that promise now, not to walk away, to spend it. Whatever advantage you've been hoarding for the assembly, whatever card you meant to keep hidden till the grand day, I want it played tonight for her. You gave me your word." She watched him weigh it, not whether to help. She never doubted that. But the size of the thing she was asking him to spend, he had built his whole campaign on Vaughan believing the Duke would never come. That single belief was the wall behind which they had gathered every scrap of proof. To save Tamsin tonight he would have to pull that wall down with his own hands in the open, long before he was ready, and once it was down there was no raising it again. She saw him understand exactly that. She saw him not hesitate. "I did," said Emrys, "and here's what my word is worth." He did not ride out as Mr. Ashby, dull agent. He went to the old estate room and took from a locked chest a thing Mrs. Mellingend, Quillen had kept oiled and waiting for 7 years. The Duke's own seal, the great matrix of the stag under thorns. And he wrote, in his own hand, on his own paper, a summons under his full name and title. He sent Mrs. Quillen's grandson on the fastest horse on the moor. Not to the steward, but past him, to the county sheriff at Halloway, and to every gentry house within a night's ride, all with the same 3 lines: "The Duke of Velmore is returned to his seat. He requires your presence in the sheriff's at Velmore Hall. A child of his household has been taken. It was the one card that could not be taken back." The moment it was read aloud in a single hall, the disguise was gone. The surprise was gone. Varn would know the Duke had come, and Emrys spent it, all of it, on a 9-year-old who was not even his. Without a heartbeat's hesitation, Mrs. Quillen, who had kept that seal secret through 7 years of a shut house, watched him press it into the wax and made a sound that was half a sob. "You're sure, Master Emrys?" she said, not a question but a last chance offered to unsay it. "Once this is read, the whole county knows by morning." "I know," he said. "Send it." And she squared her thin old shoulders and sent it, and the thing was done that could not be undone. "You've burned everything," Rena whispered. "The whole plan. He'll run now. He'll take the book. Let him run for a child. I'll catch a man who runs. I will not catch a grief I could have prevented and chose comfort over not twice." He was already pulling on his coat. "Now," he said for the moment, "he wants something from you badly enough to keep her breathing until he has it. Your silence, most like, or you gone from the moor before the assembly. That means she is bait, and bait is kept somewhere the fishermen can watch. Where would a man like Varn put a thing he means to use, and then be rid of?" And Rena, who knew every foot of that moor, who had walked it in grief and in girlhood, said the answer before she had finished thinking it. "The weir." He'd put her by the Bleakfen Weir. He likes his endings to rhyme. There was no time to raise the sheriff, no time for anything that deserved the name of a plan. Emrys woke the grooms who had wept to see him come home and put cudgels in their hands. Rena took down from the kitchen wall the short curved fen knife that had been Corin's, the one she had never been able to sell and never been able to bear to look at, and found her hand fit the worn grip as though it had been waiting for her. Then they rode. They rode through a dark that seemed to go on forever, the moor streaming past black and featureless, the cold cutting through Rena's cloak as though it were paper. She had made this ride in nightmares 100 times, always too late, always arriving to lanterns on the bank, and black water and nothing left to be done. She dug in her heels and prayed to a god she had mostly stopped speaking to that this time the ending would be different. Beside her, Emrys rode low and hard, the seal ring catching what little light there was, and she understood that he was afraid too, and that his fear was for her child, and that this, a powerful man frightened on behalf of a daughter that was not his, was a thing she had not known the world contained. The weir keeper's ruined cottage showed a single lantern, and one of Garrick's men dozing at a cold hearth, and in the corner a small, furious child bound at the wrists. After that it was over in less than a minute, and there was no strategy in any of it, only 2 loyal old grooms who had waited 7 years for something they were permitted to hit, and Emrys wading in among them, and Rena already across the room with Corin's knife sawing at the cords before the man had stopped moving. Tamsin, freed, did not cry. She only wound both thin arms around Rena's neck and held on with a strength that shook them both. "You came," she kept saying, into Rena's neck, fierce and disbelieving. "I told him you'd come. I told him you would." And Rena, who had promised the child's dead brother she would keep her safe and had come within one locked cottage of failing him, could not answer at all, only cling to her and tremble and count the small warm breaths against her collarbone as though each one were a coin she'd thought lost forever and found again. Emery's knelt beside them in the filthy little room and put one hand on the child's dark head, and the other, without any of them quite deciding it, over Rena's where it gripped the girl. "I have you," he said to both of them. "I have you. No one takes anything from this family again." He said it the way a man makes a vow, not the way a man offers a comfort, as though he were signing it, sealing it, entering it into some private ledger of his own that could never be falsified. And Rena, kneeling in the filth of the place where she had half expected to die, believed him completely, which frightened her nearly as much as the empty room had. This family, he had not meant to say it. She saw that he hadn't, but he did not take it back. And in the guttering lantern light his eyes met hers over the child's head, and every wall the bargain had built between them was simply, quietly gone. She never could say who moved first, only that his hand came up to her face cold and shaking, and that she turned into it, and that the kiss when it came tasted of fen mud and fear and salt, and was the truest thing that had happened to her in a year of lies. It was not a strategy. It was not a role. It was two people who had each spent so long turning away, finally in the cold, turning toward. When they broke apart, Tamsin, irrepressible alive, muttered into Rena's shoulder, "About time," and startled a wet, disbelieving laugh out of them both. But the night was not done with them. As they came up out of the fen with the child wrapped in Emrys's coat, Mrs. Quillen's grandson met them white-faced on the drove road, his horse blown, his message worse than any of them had feared. "Your Grace the Steward, word's out that you've come. The letters did their work, but Varn's not run. He's called his men in and barred the steward's house, and he set Pettifer's desk and every loose paper in it burning in the yard." The boy swallowed, "and the sheriff sends word he'll come to the assembly and hear you. But he'll hear Varn, too, fair and equal, and judge on what's shown. Whatever proof you had at that house, Your Grace, by morning it'll be ash." For a long moment, none of them spoke. They had saved the child and lost the war in the same night, for what was a duke's word, or a widow's grief, or an old woman's grudge against a respectable steward. Once the only proof that could hang him was smoke on the morning wind. Rena felt the sweetness of the rescue curdle in her chest. Emrys looked back the way they had come, toward the dull glow already staining the sky above the steward's house, and his face in the false dawn was very hard to read. "Then we have, until morning," he said, "to find something, fire cannot take with it." The assembly gathered under Velmore's own roof on a hard, bright morning, exactly as Aldous Varn had planned it, and nothing else about the day went as he had. He had summoned the county to watch him take the last free farms. They came instead because a dead rumor had walked. The Duke of Velmore was returned. The great hall that had stood shut for 7 years blazed with fires the old servants had lit weeping, and into it came the gentry of 3 valleys, and the tenants Varn had meant to cow, and the sheriff of the county with 2 officers at his back, and Mrs. Fenwick in black, bombazine, like a small, fierce crow, and at the front, where the steward had set a table to sign lives away, stood Aldous Varn in his good black, smiling, as though nothing at all were wrong, because a man who has spent the night burning the evidence has every reason in the world to smile. Rena stood to the side of the dais where Emrys had placed her, in dark green, her chin up, and made herself meet the eyes that found her, and a great many did, sliding over her, wondering aloud behind fans whose creature the widow was and what she thought she was doing at a duke's right hand. A month ago the weight of all that looking would have folded her in half. Now she let it wash past. She had kept her feet on the weir bank the night men named her husband's drowning in accident. She could keep them in a warm hall while the county wondered at her. Somewhere in the crowd Tamsin's hand was tight in Mrs. Quillen's. Somewhere in the crowd she prayed with everything she had. A frightened clerk had made up his mind, for she knew what Emrys knew, that their proof was ash, the true book was ash, Pettifer's rent rolls were ash. All they had left was a single loose page, a copied column, an old woman's grievance, and a small man who might or might not, when the moment came, find his voice. Then Emrys stepped up onto the dais of his own hall, and the beard was gone, and the fine coat was on, and the great signet rode plain on his hand for all to see, and Mrs. Quillan by the door said, in a carrying voice thick with tears, the words she had waited 7 years to say, "His Grace Emrys Cardew, Duke of Velmore." The sound the hall made was worth the whole hard road to hear it. Aldous Varn's smile did not slip so much as freeze, held up by nothing at all. Beside him Corvina had gone white and perfectly still, and Rena watched the woman's eyes find Emrys's face, and finally, far too late, place it. The boy, she must have seen a dozen times, grown into the one man her whole scheme had been built on never seeing again. "Your Grace," Aldous recovered first, bowing low, spreading his hands. This is a joy past speaking, Your Grace. So the rumor was true. You'll find the estate in perfect order, every account balanced, every. I have seen the estate. Varn Emrys did not raise his voice. He did not have to. I have walked it on foot in rags, and slept in its ditches, and been turned from a door by folk too frightened of you to shelter a dying man in the dead of winter. I have seen Cold Harbor Farm. He let the name fall into the silence. You have charged rent against Cold Harbor for 3 Michaelmas quarters running. It is in the accounts you sent me overseas, all balanced and all sweet. I stood in Cold Harbor a month past Varn. It burned to its footings 4 winters ago. There is nothing there now but nettles and a fallen chimney. He turned at last to the assembled county. So who paid him rent from that far, my friends? The nettles, the crows, or did the money simply move from this ledger to that pocket, year after year, off a farm with no living soul left on it? To notice a murmur went through the hall like wind through standing barley. Your Grace mistakes an old tenancy for a fraud. Aldous tried, palms turned up to the room, appealing from one reasonable man to a gathering of reasonable men. Cold Harbor's rents were carried on the books pending resettlement, a common practice. Any steward here will tell you as much. Resettlement. Emrys's voice cut clean across it. You resettled Nettles, then. And Marsh Bottom forfeited on a debt of £90 against a man who could not write his own name to borrow it. And the Sowerby lease, and the Petheridge lease, and 40 more, every one of them balanced sweet in the account you shipped to a grieving fool 3 countries away, who signed whatever you sent him, because looking homeward hurt too much to read it. For the first time his composure showed what it cost him. The words came from somewhere raw. That fool is done signing, Varn. He has come home to read. A clerk's error, Aldous said, and his voice had thinned to a reed. One mistake in a mountain of honest figures. Then let us count the mistakes. And here was the moment Rena had lain awake dreading, the moment their proof was smoke, but Emrys had never meant to fight this with paper alone. I could show you the false accounts. The true ones your master burned in his own yard last night. Half this county saw the smoke of it. But burned paper proves nothing, and I promised this would be done in the open by the law on what can be sworn to. So I will not show you a book at all. He looked out over their heads. I will show you the people it was written about. Stand up, he said gently, to the tenants ranged along the cold stone walls. If Aldous Vaughn ever charged you a debt you never borrowed, stand up if you paid a rent and were charged it a second time on paper. Stand if you are not too afraid. His Grace is home now, and no man or woman here will lose a roof for telling the truth in their lord's own hall. I give you my word on the stage. For a long, agonizing moment no one moved. A year of terror does not lift in a single breath. Then Mrs. Fenwick rose, alone, deliberate, an old rich woman with nothing left to lose, and said, He ruined my nephew with a debt of heir, and the boy died of it. I'll swear that on any book you care to name, for a breath it hung there, one old woman's voice, alone in a hall full of held breath. Then old Nan Petheridge hauled herself up on a stick and said in a cracked shout, "They charged my jack rent on a buyer that fell down in my own mother's time. I kept the receipts. 7 years I've kept the receipts, as though she had been waiting all that while for someone to ask. And after her, a farmer stood, and then his wife, and then in ones and twos, and then in a wave that could not be called back, the people of the Cindermore got to their feet all down the length of the hall, 30, 40, 50 of them, the poor and the frightened and the robbed, standing at last in the firelight, until it was Aldous Varn who stood alone in a room where every other soul was on their feet. "This is a mummer's show," Corvina Varn said, cold and clear, cutting across the rising noise. "Grudges and gossip, not one of them can prove a single figure. You have whipped peasants' resentment into a bonfire, your grace, and warmed your widow's revenge at the blaze of it, for we all see now whose creature she is." Her eyes raked Rena from hem to crown. "Where is your proof?" "Real proof. In a hand a court will hang a man for the hall quieted. Uncertain. It was the right question. It was, in the end, the only question." And into the silence, from the side of the room, came a small, reedy voice that shook so hard it could barely hold a word upright. "In mine." Wilkin Pettifer stepped out from the wall, gray and sweating, clutching to his chest, not ash but a fat, cracked ledger bound in green, and Rena understood, with a rush that stung her eyes, exactly what the little clerk had done. He had not let it burn. "He told me to fire the desk," Pettifer said, gaining with every word a fraction of a voice he had not owned in 7 years. "I fired the desk. I fired the rent rolls, the copies, the chaff. All of it, just as you said. But the true book, the second book that I have kept in my own hand, that has every doubled rent and every false debt and every little cross, his eyes found Rena's and held them, that one I carried home inside my coat, and I have not slept and I am done not sleeping." He set the green ledger down on the signing table with both hands, the way a man lays down a stone he has carried up a mountain. "It is all here, your grace, every name, Corin Merrow's among them, dated 3 days before they drowned him, and the order to do it, in a hand I would know in the pitch dark, because I sat at that man's right elbow for 7 years. He looked at last directly at Aldous Varn, and something like peace came into his ruined face. "God forgive me for the writing of it. It's all here." After that it went very fast, the way the end of a long thing so often does. The sheriff took up the green book, and read 1 page, and went gray, and read another. Garrick lunged for the great door, and found the Duke's grooms, and 2 officers already set across it. He turned then, cornered, and did the thing that cornered cruelty always does. He cast about for the weakest throat in the room. "She's lying. They're all lying." That clerk would swear the sky was green to save his own neck. But his eyes had gone to Rena, and to the small dark head beside Mrs. Breen. Quillen and Rena saw him gather himself to name the child aloud, here, in front of everyone, as though a threat that had worked in a lonely lane could work in a hall that had just found its feet. It could not. A low sound moved through the standing tenants, dangerous as a tide turning, and the 2 nearest officers stepped in, and whatever Garrick Varn had meant to say died unspoken behind a bitten lip. The lonely lanes were all gone. There were none left for him anywhere on the Cindermore. Corvina said one colder, clever thing into the noise, and discovered that no one any longer was listening to her, which was, for a woman such as she was, perhaps the cruelest sentence of the whole day. Rena had thought she would feel triumph, the hot, bright rush of the revenge she had nursed for a year. What she felt instead was something quieter and far larger. A weight she had carried so long, she had stopped feeling its edges lifting all at once. Corin's name had been spoken aloud in his lord's own hall as a murdered man and not a drunkard. It was not everything, but it was the thing she had promised him on the Weir bank, and she had kept it. At the door, Emrys stopped the steward one last time. "You'll have your trial," the Duke said. "Fair and public. And by the law you spent 7 years pretending to serve, which is more mercy than you gave a single soul on this moor. That is not for your sake, Varn. It is so that everyone you wronged can watch it done properly and know that it is real, and finally sleep." He glanced back down the crowded, weeping, cheering length of his own hall. "Justice. Not merely the ending you have earned. The one they have." Then they took Aldous Varn away in irons, and the people of the Cindermoor filled the Duke's hall with a sound that had not been heard in it for 7 years. The sound the frightened make when they discover, all together and all at once, that they are not afraid any more. It was very late when the hall finally emptied, and the fires had burned down to a low red glow, and Rena found Emrys standing where he must have stood as a boy, beneath the portrait of a fair young woman with a grave, kind face. "Aveline," she said. "It was not a question." "She would have liked you," he said. "She was always braver than me. She'd have gone out into that storm the very first time and never shut the door at all." He turned from the portrait. "I keep thinking of that. The door. You shut. You have spent this whole month believing it was the worst thing you ever did, and it was the reason you found me at the second fence and hid me from Garrick, and stood in Fenwick's parlor, and turned a whole moor onto its feet. If you had let me in that first night, Rena, I would have been a fed and comfortable stranger by your taproom fire, and Varn would have hanged you both for the crime of it by Candlemas. That's a very generous way to forgive a coward. I am done letting either of us use that word." He came and stood close, and did not reach for her, only looked. Rena thought of all the men who had ever wanted something from her. Her father, who had traded her marriage for a forgiven debt. Curran, who had loved her truly, and then left her to grief. Even this man at the beginning, who had wanted a weapon and a witness, and been honest enough to say so. She had learned in a hard school to hear the want lying underneath the words. She listened for it now, and could not find it. What she heard instead was a man offering rather than asking, laying something down at her feet and stepping back and leaving her free to take it up, or not. "I struck a bargain with you in a stable for justice," he said. "I told you it was strategy. I told myself the same for a long while, because it was safer than the truth, and I have always been so very good at choosing what is safe. But somewhere between the second fence and the weir I lost the ability to tell the difference between keeping you safe because I needed you, and keeping you safe because a world with you gone from it had become a thing I could not stand to imagine. I don't want the bargain anymore, Rena. The bargain is paid in full. I want the thing that grew up underneath it, that neither of us asked for, and I would now give up the dukedom to keep." He drew an unsteady breath. "I turned away from love once, because losing it had very nearly killed me. I would rather be brave this time and keep it, if you will have a reformed coward, and a drafty great hall, and one extremely opinionated child." Rena Marrow, who had turned a man from her door on the coldest night of the year and then gone out into the dark to save him, anyway, put both her hands flat against the chest of the Duke of Velmore and felt his heart going every bit as fast as her own. "I turned you away once," she said. "I have been opening that door in my mind every night since, wishing I had done it right the first time." She smiled, and it trembled and it held. "Come in then, out of the cold, for good, this time." He came in, and this kiss had no fenmud in it, and no fear, only firelight and a great house waking slowly up around them, and the particular warmth of two people who had learned the hard way exactly what the cold was worth. Rena found she was smiling against his mouth. For the first time since a man had shoved her whole life into black water, the future was not a thing to be survived. It was a door standing open, warm light spilling out of it, and no reason left in all the world not to walk through. Spring came late to the Cinder Moor that year, but it came. Aldous Varn was tried at the Holloway Assize before a full court and a fuller gallery, and the green ledger was read into the record page by damning Page, and Wilkin Pettifer swore to every line of it in a voice that no longer shook. Varn was condemned for the murder of Corin Merrill, and for the long, slow theft of a whole country, and the mild, broad face that had smiled a Moor into ruin, smiled at no one in the end. Corvina Varn, who had forgotten nothing and repented less, was put out of the county with what the law allowed her and not one thing beyond it, and was heard of afterward only as a cold woman growing old in a rented townhouse, complaining to any who would still listen of how badly she had been used. Garrick answered for the abduction and served his years for it, and came out at the end of them to find that the name of Varn opened no door on the Cinder Moor at all. The false leases were burned a far better bonfire than the Stewards. The stolen farms went back to the families that had held them. Cold Harbor was rebuilt with the Duke's own coin, and the Crows moved on, and the doubled rents were repaid to the last penny out of everything the Varns had hoarded away. It did not bring back the dead, nothing ever does, but it let the living hold their heads up, and on the Cinder Moor, after 7 years bent double, that was very nearly a resurrection. There were harder things no court could mend, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Some of the ruined had not lived to see their farms come back, some had scattered too far to be found, some flinched still at the sight of a man in good black, and perhaps always would. But Emrys rode the moor now the way his grandfather had, and learned the tenants by name, and sat in the court at Holloway to see the small cases judged fairly. And when folk thanked him, he told them the truth, that their suffering had been the price of his comfort, and he had the rest of his life to pay it back. Rena did not close the Thornwick. She did something better with it. With Emrys's coin, and her own hard good sense, she made the old inn into a house that turned no one away, a place on the cruel moor road, where any traveler at all, beggar or lord or ragged stranger, could find a fire and a bed and a bowl of something hot, and never once be asked for leave or coin or name. A lamp burned in its window every night of the year. She hired the widowed and the broken to keep it, the very ones the Varns had ruined, and gave them wages and a reason to rise, and folk began to call the place, first as a joke and then simply as its name, the Open Door. Tamsin, whose chest grew strong at last in a warm house, liked to tell anyone who would hold still that she had been the very first person taken in there for good. She was not quite right about that, but no one ever had the heart to correct her. It was not charity, and Rena would bristle if anyone was fool enough to call it so. Charity looks down. The Open Door looked across. She had been on the wrong side of a shut door on the coldest night of her life, and she had learned there the one thing she wanted the whole moor to carry in its bones, that you cannot tell, from a ragged coat and a desperate face, whether the soul out in the cold is a beggar, or a duke, or simply a person worth the saving, and that it ought not die, the end, to make the slightest difference, which. They were married in the spring in the small moor church whose door had once worn Varn's cruel notices nailed to its oak, and the whole Cinder Moor came, and it was nothing whatever like the cold contract Rena had once imagined a duchess must make. It was a farmer's daughter marrying the man she had dragged out of the snow in a church full of people who had learned together, the hard way, how to be unafraid. Mrs. Fenwick wept all through it and denied it fiercely afterward. Mrs. Ma Quillen wept and did not bother to deny anything. Pettifer, who slept soundly now, stood up straight in a good new coat and was, the whole parish agreed, entirely unrecognizable. On the night of the wedding, when the music had faded and the last guests had gone singing off down the drove road, Emrys and Rena walked out together under a sky at last swept clean of snow, and stood a while looking down the dark moor toward the single far light of the Open Door, burning steady on the very road where a ragged stranger had once begged for shelter and been refused. "Do you ever think of that night?" she asked him. "How close it all came. If you'd knocked at any other door. If I'd stayed a coward 1 hour longer. Every day," he said. "But I have stopped calling it luck. 100 doors could have opened easily to me that night and shown me nothing but a warm room and my own comfort. Only one shut in my face and then opened again, in the dark, at the cost of everything the woman behind it had. He drew her in against the last of the cold. You did not fail me at that door, Rena. You saved us both, first by keeping a child alive, and then by being unable to live with what it cost. That is not a coward. That is the bravest person I have ever known. The moor wind had lost its teeth. It came up off the fen, now soft and green-smelling, and behind them, in the lit house, a child laughed. Rena thought of the girl she had been a year ago, standing frozen with her spine against a barred door, certain she was doing the only thing a friendless woman could do. She wished she could reach back through all that cold and tell her, "Hold on. Go out into the storm. The worst night of your life is only the door to the best of it, if you are just brave enough to open it a second time. Then let's keep it lit," she said, watching the far lamp burn. "Every night, for whoever's out there in the cold." And they did. Thank you for staying to the very end. If this story moved something in you, the courage it takes to open a door twice, the difference a single act of mercy can make, the way even the coldest night can turn, at last, toward the light, then do this one small thing. Tell someone about it. Leave a comment and tell us the moment that stayed with you, and where in the world you are listening from tonight. If you believe, as we do, that ordinary people can stand up to powerful cruelty and win, then subscribe and ring the bell, so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. Every door you open for someone else keeps a light burning on a dark road. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that no one at all deserves to be left out in the cold.